In this video, we are going to see how to characterize a character. The characterization in MotionBuilder consists in creating a control rig for a skeletal mesh. A skeletal mesh being a series of bone, a hierarchy of bone, and a skin mesh. Of course, in Mobu, you can't create that skin mesh, you can't skin, so usually you import that skeletal mesh as an FBX from another DCC package like Max or Maya. By the way, if you have trouble selecting your skeleton, sometimes you misclick and you select the mesh instead, I really advise selecting the meshes and putting them in a new group, create and maybe call that meshes. And in that group, unselect peak and transforms. This way you can't select the mesh anymore. And if some joints are a little too small, select them and you can increase the size if that's easier. So if I go to my schematic view, I see that I have my hierarchy starting with the root that's between the feet. That's very important to have a root bone because that's where the character is going to be compared to the capsule in the game. So that's a reference point. And I have a couple meshes that are a bit all over the place right now because I have like a separate head and a separate body. So we will organize everything. And I have a long take with a ROM here that was exported with the Skeletal Mesh. So the first thing I like to do is maybe duplicate that take and call it A pose. And select every bone in the hierarchy. To do so, you can hold space and right click on the root. You can do that in schematic view or in the viewport directly. So I selected all the bones. I'm going to delete all the animation I have here and just make that clip 1 frame long. And being on the first frame, I will key. And I will make sure I have a key that captures this A pose because this A pose, we want to keep it for later because it's way easier for an animator to start animating from the A pose. But now I'm going to duplicate that take and I'm going to call it T pose. So now I'm on the T pose take. Why do we have a T pose take? It's because when we're going to characterize our character and assign it a control rig, we want that character to be in a perfect T pose. That means having the arms like orthographically parallel to the ground. So what I do is I roughly rotate those for now, like this. So I do a rough rotation like this, and then with the rotation transform tool, being in global, so that means in world space, I look at the rotation that I have here, starting from the clavicle. And you can see that usually you will have values that are close to 0, 90, minus 90. So what I do is I round those numbers to the closest multiply of 90. So here I have 89, so I'm going to put that value to 90. And the two other values are fairly low. I have 9, I have 6 on Y and Z. I'm going to put them at 0. So now my left clavicle here is strictly parallel to the floor. Okay? And so those numbers may be different if you have a different axis order. In my case, I have like the x-axis pointing down to the child, and I have the y-axis pointing forward, and the z-axis pointing negative down. Pointing down. So those numbers may be different. The only thing is you want to make sure you are in global. Here I'm going to put 90 and 0 again. And same for the lower arm. I skip the twist bone, go to the lower arm. So maybe the lower arm here, I'm going to put it close to what I want, and then look at global and okay, 90, 0, 0. Same for the hand, 90, 0, 0. And I just have to do the same for the other arm. So here it's minus 90, 0, 0. minus 90, 0, 0. So you always want to go from the top of the chain here, the clavicle, and they go down. Because of course if I first rotate the forearm and then I rotate the arm, I'm going to be in trouble. So I always go from top to bottom. And minus 90, 0, 0. So now that I've done that, I want to select both arms, or I can select the entire hierarchy and key again. Don't forget to key. This way, on my T pose, I start having this nice setup for the arms, and if I go back to the A pose, I still have the original bind pose, the pose that the mesh was created in. Now we want to do the same for the legs, because the legs also need to be straight down and like perpendicular to the floor. The thing is, if I rotate the legs like this, you can see that in the model the feet are fairly flat, and I want to keep that rotation, because if I rotate the legs like this, I start having the feet like they are now a little bit like that compared to the floor. So what I do is I just select both feet and I do a Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V. So I have both bones copied like this, okay? And those bones have exactly the same rotation as the feet. So I will keep that for later. Now I can do the same thing I've done with the arms. So I roughly rotate the legs like that to get an approximation. Then I go into make sure I'm in global mode, and I look at the values and I round them to 90. So here I have minus 90, 0, and 90. On the other one, I have 90, 0, minus 90. Again, those values could be 180 for you, it depends. Here 90, 0, minus 90. And for the legs, because I don't want to, break the knee on this angle, I sometimes come back to local and I look at the value and I try to see if I broke it too much on Y. Maybe I'm going to put 0 again on that value to keep that angle. It kind of depends how arced you want the legs to be. And now that I've rotated my legs, they are perfectly straight like that. If I look at the feet, they are angled, like I was saying. So I'm going to select this foot and hold X to align it to the bone that I copy-pasted earlier. And I'm going to align only the rotation, of course, not the translation. I'm going to do the same for the right foot. Align, rotation. And if I look at those feet, they are a little bit tucked out, right? They are a bit angled out like this on the outside. So what I want to do is maybe make sure they are like kind of facing forward. So I might need just a little rotation here. So usually I go to the snapping option, and I select like 5 degrees or something like that, just to make sure they are pointing forward. This is important later on for the feet contact setup. The feet really need to be pointing forward. The thing is, you need to make sure that they are symmetrical and you don't rotate one foot more than the other, obviously. So usually you have the Y value that's like your symmetric value. So maybe I can make that like minus 60, and here be 60. So when you come to the sides, one way to make sure that they are parallel is to look at it from the side, and you can see that they are you only see one bone, so it means they are exactly on the same spot, right? If one bone was rotated like this, you would see something like that. So this is one way to check, and the other way to check is to select maybe the ball joint and look at the global transform, and if the transform are the same as the other foot, except on X you will see a minus value. That means that you have like parallel feet, which is good. So now I can key again to make sure I capture this positioning. And one last thing is you can see that because I rotated the feet down under the the body, they are now a little bit too deep into the floor. So I can take my pelvis and move it up a little. And it's possible that your pelvis is a little bit like too much in front or back behind the root bone. So sometimes I correct that and I realign the body a little bit more centered with the center axis that you see here. The last thing we need to fix for the T-pose are the fingers. The fingers usually on models, they can have like very different posing and different flow. And for the retargeting to work nicely in MotionBuilder, which means like transferring animations between different models, it's best to have a consistent finger pose. Just like we did for the limbs, we did something very consistent. It doesn't look natural. The T-pose like feels a bit broken, especially in the shoulder area. But at least because it's a very straight pose, every time we pose our characters before characterizing, it will mean that they will have a consistent T-pose. So sharing animations and transferring animations will give better results. So it's the same for the fingers. So usually for the fingers, you should have like the same orientation of the joints. So you should be able to select like all of the 4 fingers together without the thumb. And you should be able to do the same as you did for the legs and the arms, and rotate them roughly, and then use the approximation. So maybe here I'm going to do, see here I have 160, so my approximation is going to be 180, then 0, and then 0. Okay, and I can go down with the up and down arrow keys and do the same thing. 0, 0, 0. And same for the last phalange. So now my fingers are perfectly straight. Can do the same on the other side. Approximate. And in global mode, I'm close to 0 here. Okay. Don't forget to key everything if you're not in AutoKey. And now we want to do the same for the thumb. So the thumb is a little trickier because it's not as obvious. Usually I like rotate it up on Z like that to bring it kind of flat. But I don't want it to be like super straight like that inside the hand. That feels a little awkward. Usually I keep a little rotation out like this. So maybe you just bring up the first phalange and put like the X value at 90, the Z value at 0, and maybe the Y value I select a certain, like maybe 30 or 45. Might depend how wide the hands are and how the thumb is modeled. But I try to replicate that value on the other one. So I bring it up. Okay, first value minus 90. Here I have minus 30, and here is 0. I may go and do the same for the other phalange. So here minus 90. Here I'm not going to put minus 30 because that would give me a straight finger. Maybe I'm going to put like minus 10, and here is 0. $90, 10, 0. Again, those aren't magic values that will work for every model. It depends on what you have. The most important is to have something consistent between left and right, and have something that looks right for your character. But usually that's the pose I'm trying to find. Just the thumb straight along the hand, but with a slight curve. Key everything again, and go in side view to make sure your fingers are well aligned. You're looking for this kind of artifacts, and if you have this kind of artifacts where you see a lot of finger bones on the same spot, it probably means left and right aren't matching. So here it looks good. Okay, and so we're almost done with our T-pose. We're just missing one single thing now. It's the fingertips. So you can see here in my skeleton, I have the phalange bones that actually deform the skeleton. But I am missing an extra joint at the very end here, at the tip. Those aren't necessary in the game engine because they don't actually deform the mesh, right? Because the last phalange is deformed by this bone here. But I do need an object. It can be a bone, it can be a null, at least to tell me where the fingertip is. This is very important for the IK fingers to work well on the control rig itself. So it's something that's only required in MotionBuilder. You don't need to export those bones in the game engine after that, unless you have some IK system in the engine, but usually it's not the case. So for me, the easiest when those fingertips don't come with the rig is to just go in, select all the finger, the third phalange. So here it's 0,3, and just copy paste them. So I copy paste all these bones here, okay? And now I'm gonna come in and parent all of them to the first bone. Then you can see that I parented everybody, and my first bone is the duplicate of the middle here, the middle bone. So I'm just gonna unselect the first one with Control and then drag, and I'm gonna come to the next finger and parent those. Then I'm gonna unselect the first one, parent, first one, parent. I just find this little trick to be faster to reparent. To keep my selection and unselect one by one. That prevents me from having to go all the way there and then back and forth, you know. Okay, so now I have a duplicate. They are still in the same spot, but for each finger I have an extra bone that I can, you know, move around now. You can see here. So maybe it's easier if I select them all once again and put them in red. So our goal is to move all those fingertips out so they match the end. First, I'm going to rename them though. I don't have a tool to rename those quickly, so usually I just go in and manually change that number to 4, but that depends on the naming convention you have, of course. In my case, I have the number before underscore left. That's the naming convention in the default models in Unreal. So unfortunately, I have to do that manually. If someone has a script to do some quick renaming in MotionBuilder, that'd be awesome. Thankfully, we only have 10 fingers, so we're almost done already. Of course, if you have actual toes on a creature, for instance, you are going to need to do the same thing on the toes. Okay, so we have cool numbers now, and I'm just going to move them out. So one by one, I take the thumb, for instance. I'm in local space, transform, and I move them out. And then I just make like a round value, like 3.6 instead of 3.62 in this case. Same for the index. So what you can do is actually select them all like this and put a little value, random, just drag it out like this. This way it's easier to grab them and fine tune after because they're not on the spot of the phalange number 3. So we can move them like that. Okay, and round these numbers out to 1 digit after the dot. So it's easier to copy that value over the other fingers, basically. Okay, so now I can just stay in the schematic view and select the middle. So for now I've worked on the left hand. I select the middle finger, I look at the value, and I just copy that value with a minus That's why it's easier to have like round values. Don't forget to select everything in key. And now I can see that I have like nice fingertips joints at the end of my fingers. We're now able to define the character. So in the character controls, you have this define skeleton option. Say yes, define, and you have this window here. So you have all these empty slots in the character, and you need to fill them in with the bones of your character. The easiest is to double click and then come in and select the bone that corresponds to the slot. And the bones that you see here are the bones that are mandatory. So your character needs at least a pelvis, a spine bone, a head, and 2 arms, 2 legs. That works exactly the same if you have a quadruped character. Still 2 arms, 2 legs. I'm going to select the first bone in the spine. For the spine, you have a sub-menu here to add more spine bones. So you can have a total of 10 bones. Those 9 bones plus the base bone here. So I can double click and select them here. If you prefer, you can do it in the schematic view as well. Double click and select. It's okay if you don't fill them all up. You can have less bones, right? Those aren't mandatory. Same for the neck. And the head. So the head is really the skull, right? You don't need a head and bone at the tip of the skull. Then let's do the clavicles. So here's the left shoulder. Technically you can have 2 clavicle bones. That's, I mean, if you have a weird creature, you might need that. Or if you have like really large shoulders, but 90% of the time you only have like 1 clavicle bone, which is totally normal. The left arm, the left forearm. Oh, and you can see here that because I have perfectly symmetrical arms, it automatically detects that when I fill in the left side, it detects that I have an equivalent bone for the right side. So here, when I select my lower arm on the left side, boom, my right side was automatically filled in. And if you have a doubt, if you want to make sure you filled in your slots properly, you can always select it and it will select the bone that you assign, so you can make sure that it's working properly. So let's continue. You have the hand bone here. So you have some slots for roles as well. I prefer to set up the roles manually with a relation constraint, which will be another video. But if you want, you can assign your roll bones here. I strongly suggest having those roll bones as a separate branch. So here I have my clavicle, my upper arm, my lower arm. Okay. So clavicle, upper arm, lower arm, and the lower arm is a direct child of the upper arm. The twist bone is a side branch. So we assign our pelvis, our spine, our head and neck, our arms. Now we can keep going with the legs. Left leg, left calf, and the foot, left foot. So this is my first bone of the foot, the ankle, and I can fill in the ball as well. So if I go here in the sub view on the left foot, for example, I can assign the left toe base. So that's my ball joint. And if you have toes, you could assign them as well if you want. I'm just going to make sure and double check I have the same ball joint on the right foot. Okay, for some reason it didn't detect my right toe base, so I'm going to assign that. So now I have both the right ball and the left ball assigned. Okay, so there are 2 things that I never assign. I never found a use for it. If you know a use for it, please let me know. But here you have the hips translation. I never have an extra bone just for hip translation. I think this might be something useful if you have a BIP character, a biped character coming from 3ds Max, where you have a bone on top of the pelvis to drive everything, the BIP01. But that's the strange hierarchy coming from Max. Usually you have the pelvis and it's directly apparently to the root. Okay, so I never use the hips translation. And the reference bone, I highly recommend not to assign it to the root bone, because the reference node is going to be, after that, the parent of all the control rig, and I prefer to keep the root separate and have another object driving the root bone. So usually you don't want to fill in anything in the reference. That's my advice. Now I just need to fill in the fingers. So for the fingers, you can have a finger base. I've never worked with a rig that had an extra joint for this, so I'm not going to use it here. You can also add metacouples. So if you have an extra joint here before the pinky or before the ring, for instance, you can fill those here. Sometimes it's useful to have like more advanced deformations to make a good fist pose, for example. But less focused on the brighter slots here. Those are for the main fingers. So the 3 phalanges and the tip here. You can see that we can fill in the tip bone, which is the bone we have in red here. So make sure you work on the correct hand. So here I'm on the left hand, and I'm going to select the first phalange of the thumb, and when I select it, it's going to jump to the other hand and show me that it found the same bone for the right thumb. So now, because I'm on the right hand window, I might as well just go in and select the second phalange of the right thumb and select the corresponding bone here. And now it jumped again to the other hand. So every time you're going to fill in a bone, it's going to jump back and forth between left and right. So the easiest I found is to just do it from the schematic view with both hands visible with all the fingers, and just do it directly here, so it's easier than doing it from the viewport. So I'm going to select the third phalange of the left thumb. Now I jump to the right hand. I'm going to select the tip of the right thumb and select this bone here. Now I can keep going with the left index and so on. Right index, left index, and right index tip, then left middle 1, right middle 2, left middle 3, and right middle 4. Then left middle ring, right wing 2, left ring 3, and right ring 4. And left pinky 1, right pinky 2, left pinky 3, and right pinky 4. So it's very easy to make mistakes, especially with the view. You want to make sure that you're working on the left hand. So if you look at it from the top like this, you can see that this is the left hand. It's corresponding, and before going any further, it's good to double check and select those slots and make sure that you selected the correct finger. So as you select those slots one by one, you see that it's always the same finger, because it's very easy to assign one phalange from the left hand and there's another phalange from the right hand and mix things up. So always double check. And if you check at least one hand, you're 99% sure that the other hand is correct. Okay, now that we have a nice characterization, it's all green. It's possible that if you do the characterization outside of a T-pose, so if you do it on an A pose, you will see this orange warning. That's because you don't have a perfect T-pose. So that's why we did that T-pose at the beginning. It's all green. And what you can do is save this definition. Maybe call it humanoid template or whatever you need, and save it somewhere where you can easily find. Maybe in that HIK characterization tool in your app data folder, because it's the default path, so it's going to be easier for you to find. This way, if you have other characters that have the same naming convention, the same bone names, it's going to be easier, and you'll just be able to select one bone and load with this icon, load the same definition that you just saved. This is going to make things way easier when you have a lot of characters to characterize. That's why in skeletons, you should never have unique names. You should never have like the first bone be called a bob root. You just want it to be abstract and neutral. You just want root, pelvis, and you don't want the name of the character underscore the name of the bone. That's a really bad habit, because you can't share templates, you can't share skeletons once in your game engine. So you want neutral bone names like this. Now that our character definition is all green, we can lock it, lock the character. It's going to ask if the character is a biped or quadruped, so in this case it's a biped, and it says that we need to make sure the character is facing positive z-axis. So if I just take one step back, cancel, here we're good to go, because you can see here on the gizmo in my scene that the z-axis is pointing forward and my character is pointing in this direction. Because it's possible that the DCC package you imported the skeletal mesh from at the beginning had a different orientation, maybe like this, maybe it was Y-up like that. But of course, you always need to make sure you start with a character facing positive Z in your MotionBuilder scene. So we can lock and say biped. Nothing changed yet, because we still have our character using a source none. So the source of our character is still the skeleton itself and not a control rig. To create a control rig, you can just go to bake plot and bake plot to control rig. And because there's no control rig yet, it's going to ask if you want FK and IK or just IK only. Always select FK, IK. I don't see why you would just do IK. There's no reason to do that. And now you finally have a control rig, and the character controls window has changed. The source is control rig. You can always go back to none and see your skeleton. So we have a nice T-pose here. And you can go back to A pose. And in the A pose, if you're in source none, you will see your original A pose. So the bind pose of the character. So you can also bake that to the control rig. And now you have the same control rig, but with the A pose, so it's way nicer to start animating from that pose. So there's a couple settings you want to tweak on your rig before going any further. Usually I immediately pin translation and rotation on the pelvis, and I put the thigh, the chest, and the shoulders, as well as the head, to IK blend rotation R, and I pin the rotation. That's because it's my usual setup for animating in full body. And I also select the feet, the ball, and I put the IK translation to 100% as well. And if you select your character in the navigator, you can rename the character. I highly recommend doing that, so that here in character you don't just see a abstract name character, but maybe it's player, maybe it's I don't know, dragon, whatever, or Bob, or at least name it. And in the control rigs drop down, it's also good to rename it and maybe call it, I like to call it player, so it's the name of my character, underscore CR, control rig. That's why it's short. And if you select any of those controls, you will see that they have a name and an underscore character control. So this character control is a namespace, and here in the namespaces you can find it and rename it as well. So I'm also going to call it a player underscore CTRL. This way you have a better naming than just character, because otherwise if you have several characters, they're all going to be named character, and it's going to be a mess if you work with scenes with multiple characters. So first step, renaming. Second step is tweaking some of the settings. So select your character in the navigator, and in the either in the properties or here in the navigator itself, you'll see some options. First thing you want to change is here in the fingers, disable human finger limits. This is an awful option that just make animating fingers a pain. I don't know why it's on by default. It's gonna, sometimes you're gonna push your controls further, and it's gonna apply some limits only on the joint. So now there's a difference between my joint position and my controls position, which is really a really bad thing. It's really a nightmare. So just disable that, and now the fingers can go as far as you animate them. So it's just up to the animators to animate properly, but you know, you're free to animate as you want. So disable that option. Very important. I don't see any reason why you would want that. The second thing I usually change is here in the roll. In the inline option, it's the roll of the knee. Here it's at 60% by default. So if you come down here to the calves, and if you select the foot, when you rotate the foot, you will see that the calf rotates as well. And that's a very strange behavior, because that means the calf is rotating here, like the roll of the knee is pivoting, and that's something really strange that, I mean, you don't really want any of that. I think if you want to solve a twist on the knee, you would have a second bone here, a twist bone that the ankle is skinned onto, and you know, set up a twist like you would on the forearm. But usually you don't want the calf to rotate directly from here, from the calf joint. That's something that you know, if you then export that FBX data like this and send it to Maya, there's a high chance that the Maya rig doesn't support that, or if you send that to Unreal, there's a high chance that your IK solver won't really like such rotation. So just put those values, the knee rolls, to 0%, and now when you rotate, the calf doesn't rotate, and it's like, yes, it creates some twisting here on the ankle, but again, if you want to solve that, you want to solve that with an extra joint and not solve it with a calf rotation. That's very awkward. This way you have the same behavior here on the forearm. When you rotate the hand, nothing happens on the forearm, but again, you want to solve it with extra twist joints that would rotate with the hand roll rotation, which will be another video. And of course you have more options that you can change. You can change the character solver. To me, the MB solver is the best solver, so the default solver is good, but you can change that. You can change from biped to quadruped if when you created the control rig you didn't select the best option for your character. Fingers, yeah, you have a lot of options. You have realistic shoulder solving, for example, so when you rotate the arm, the shoulder starts rotating at some point. Personally, I just prefer to hand animate all that stuff. You have the stiffness that can be interesting for the neck, for example. It's how the neck behaves when you just rotate the head. But personally, again, I prefer all these default options. I'm used to them. And you can always change the style of your markers, because they are just visual representations. So if some bones are difficult to select, for example, some FK effectors are hidden under certain IK effectors, so hide the IK effectors and select the feet, and you can change the marker settings, the look, for example, make that a box, You can increase the size and then go to transformation pivots, geometry offset, and maybe translate it forward, scale it a little, and then redisplay the effector. So now it's way easier to come and select those controls if you need to. So you can always make things a box instead of sticks if that's easier for you. You can change things to hot cross or cubes, etc. One thing you want to set up now are the foot floor contact. If they don't show up, you can go to the toolbox here, show height, and select floor contact. I'm actually gonna undock that window and move it here. Floor contact. So you see those purple and green little squares around the feet and around the hands. Normally they should align pretty well with the feet if you define your character in a perfect T-pose with the feet facing forward, because on that definition pose, on the T-pose, when you create a control rig, the floor contact are creating orthographically like this, like they are created straight. So if your feet were positioned like this, you may see the floor contact may not line up with the foot. So that's why it was very important to have the feet pointing forward when creating the T-pose. So now you can just take them and adjust their positioning a little. So you want those to be back next to the heel. Unfortunately, you can't really fine-tune asymmetrically. Like you can't have the square in the center placed differently than the square outside. So it's an approximation, but that's okay. It's still like important to place them roughly and have them maybe around the ball area. So here I have fairly long feet. So I'm going to do something like this. Okay, so when I move around those boxes, that is reflected here in the modifiers, floor contact, and feet floor contact setup, feet contact position. So if I move that, you can see that some values are changing here. I can change the size, that's just visual, and I can change the height as well. So the height is this option. And to make sure you set them up properly, I advise coming back to the A pose and activating here the feet floor contact option. And if there's a pop like this, it means that your contacts are a little bit too low compared to the initial model. So you want to maybe raise them up a little. So maybe it's easier if you have an actual floor model, so just a plane, or maybe you come to the side here and you look at the height. So you want to adjust it so that it feels right, so maybe keep some of the shoe sole inside the floor. Okay, and you can double check by activating automatic toe base and rotating the foot, and you will see if you like the behavior of the foot. So you can always adjust back if need be. Okay, so just run a little test just to be sure it feels right. Take the pelvis, move the entire character around in full body, holding a Q. Okay, that feels about right. Notice that there are different feet contact type. You have normal for normal humanoid feet, and you have ankle, toe base, or hoof. So that depends if you have like a digitigrade leg, a Z leg like a lichen or a satyr, or if you have a hoof like a horse. So you could set those up differently. You can also adjust for the hands in case you have a character laying on the floor or walking on fours. So usually I do a quick setup as well, but because this isn't used as much, I won't go like too crazy with the setup. So now that I'm done with the feed floor contact, I hide them again. So here in my undocked window, or if I go back here in the show hide option, floor contact, because you don't need to see them when you animate. Really, it's just it's more noise than anything. After creating the control rig, you may realize something broke. Like maybe you see some weird finger hierarchy if you didn't, assign the fingers properly. So anyway, if you mess something up or if you forgot a bone, you can always come back to the definition and unlock it. When you unlock it, it's going to go back to the T-pose, so maybe you work on your T-pose take, and you can now update that posing, relock it, recreate the biped, and then you want to rebake again to the control rig. The thing is, when you do that, it doesn't recreate a control rig, so it may not solve all your issues. So if you want to start fresh, again, come back to definition, unlock, and now delete the control rig. Now when you lock again and say biped, and you bake plot to control rig, it's going to ask you again, do you want to create a new control rig, because it doesn't find one for your character. So now it created a fresh control rig, and it did keep some of the settings we set on the player, for example the finger limits, but some other settings for some reason jumped out. So for example the roll of the calf is default again, so you need to edit that once again and set it to 0. The feed floor contacts are correct, they're still what we set, and that's good. And you need to reset the pinning of your control rig because it's a new control rig, so it doesn't remember what you had set here. So the last part about characterization is more about cleaning up the scene and making sure it's well organized to start animating or to start using the scene for mocap. So when I come to the schematic view, I can see that it's a little bit all over the place. I have like several groups. I have the meshes on one side, I have the skeleton, and I now have the control rig with the reference nodes, all the IK effectors in red and blue, and all the FK effectors in yellow. So I prefer to organize those by having some nulls. So it's like groups in Maya. I will say insert and look for elements and nulls. So I drag them in the schematic view. Because I dragged them in the schematic view, I'm sure they are at 0, 0, 0, so at the scene origin. That's very important. And then in the properties, I'm gonna go to null settings and change the look to none. This way, in the viewport, I don't actually see them. Again, the goal is always to remove as much noise as you can and have the animators worry about as least as possible. So here, the null, I'm going to rename it skeleton. I'm going to copy paste it, Control C, Control V, rename that other guy. So I'm going to select auto arrange and rename that other guy models. And maybe I'm going to copy paste it one more time and call it the name of my character. So here it's player. I'm going to parent those two nulls to this. I'm going to select my root and parent it to skeleton. And I'm going to select any models that I have. So again, the model, you might have a lot of objects because the model might be split in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to parent that here. So at least, it's grouped and it's nicer to look at. Usually I like having like one main group for the skeleton and the models. So everything that comes from outside MotionBuilder and everything that's like the control rig itself. I like splitting it that way. And if I come back to the groups, I have my meshes group, which I use to untick peak and transform. I'm going to do another group that I'm going to call export. And usually I make that my first group, so I'm going to move it up in the list. And in that group, I'm going to put every bone that really matter for me when I export my animation. So back into schematic view, I'm going to select the entire skeletal hierarchy, holding space and right-clicking on the root to select all its children. But I'm going to ignore some bones. First of all, I'm going to ignore all the fingertips bones that we created here in MotionBuilder. Remember the red bones, because those aren't needed in the game engine, once again. And depending on your setup, maybe you want to ignore the twist bones if those are solved at runtime in your game engine, which is more and more the case nowadays. Maybe you have also like cloth bones or hair bones or little bones like that that are just deformers that are, again, solved at runtime. So in my case, I have the thigh twist as well, and I have some bones for the pants. So now I have a clean selection of the bones I want to export later on, and I'm going to update my group with those bones, or I can drag and drop them here in the navigator to the export group. So we've done a basic characterization for our character. And to go a little bit faster in this last step of organizing the scene, I actually use a template. So a scene that I saved with some of that stuff already set up. So if I go one step back and I delete those nulls that I created, just to show you, I'm also going to delete those two groups. Can go to File and Merge to import that other scene, and I'm going to put the link to that scene in the video description. So it's this scene, Mobu Root Control, and you have another scene which is Mobu Root and Weapon Control. So if you need to have controls to animate weapons following the hands or props, you want to use that scene. If you need something more simple, you can just use the Root Control scene. You can already see that there are a couple takes, A pose, T pose, and there are base, done, editing, to do, and temp. This is stuff I use when I want to organize my takes, when I work on multiple animations at the same time. And the A and T pose is when I put the character in T pose. So when I work on an actual character, I actually merge that scene early on as soon as I have my model in the scene. And you already see a couple things here. See that there's a plane with a checker texture. So it's just a plane here called SM ground, static mesh ground. And I have a group of nulls, so it's the same nulls that we had before, skeleton, models, and the character, which I'm immediately going to rename to player. And there's a couple other things, there's a root control and some camera stuff. We'll come back to this. So I'm going to parent my models to the model group. I'm going to parent my roots to the skeleton group. And again, those nulls are hidden, null settings set to none, and I disable transformation selection. If we come down to the group tab, I have the export group, so that's where I'm going to put again all the bones that I actually need to export. We've already done that, so I'm not going to show it again. I have a group that I call all controls, and in this group I put every control of my control rig. So here I'm going to select player control and reference, just deselect reference. I selected the entire hierarchy of both the FK and the IK effectors. So I have all the fingers, all the fingertips, absolutely everything. I'm going to drag and drop it in the all controls group, add to group. I have secondary bones, that's if I need to put some extra bones or controllers, like for the jaw, facial, for, I don't know, armors or whatever. So for now it's empty. I have a group for my camera stuff, and I have a group for meshes. I'm going to select those mesh once again, and deselect pick and transform. So again, this way I have a consistent setup for all my scenes because I always merge that template. And I have a well-organized character with the controls on one side and the skeleton and the models on the other side. The last subject you can see is this sort of arrow here. This is what I use for my root control. and we'll talk about that in a specific video about character extensions.